Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Welcome to a new unit. Alright, this is going to be the unit on World War II. Usually people are super excited about getting into World War II because it is extremely cool. Alright, however, disclaimer going into World War II, whereas World War I you probably didn't know a whole lot about, and typically my students think World War I was super cool. So you're like, hey, World War II is going to be twice as cool. Yes. All right, it is very cool. It is very complicated. All right, World War I is really fun to learn about because it's really dumb. It's just people just slamming into each other with no idea what to do, and then like trench warfare. World War II, they got a 20-year halftime basically from World War I. It gets really complicated because there's a whole lot of really smart people that are trying to destroy the enemy. It wasn't an impromptu thing with no plan. So as we go through this, you have to pay attention because it is extremely cool, but it does have a lot of moving parts, a lot of politics and stuff that go into it as well, that make it just the absolute most ridiculous, massive thing that's ever happened on planet Earth. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, in large part, is, if I can get this going here, what we're going to talk about today in large part is basically what about the leaders that came out, all right? Because World War II is a lot about the personalities that happened in the world. It was led by a handful of people. Your Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and then a guy you've never heard of that we're going to mention briefly today, a guy named Franco, all right? We're going to talk about those guys today and how they rose to power. And by them rising to power is what's going to cause World War II. Or they're going to be the ones that are going to lead it to happen. Like they're going to be the ones that start invading people and cause it to happen because they're looking for a war. All right. So what happens, and we had called this like forever away after the Treaty of Versailles. We knew peace in Europe wasn't going to last because there's so much hostilities after the Treaty of Versailles. Compounded with the fact, all right, with those tensions, when the Great Depression hit, all right, in the United States, it crushed us, but the entire world relied on the United States in order to survive prior to the Great Depression because of the Treaty of Versailles. When the United States collapsed in the Great Depression, they all did too. So all these countries around the world are in the same predicament the United States was throughout the 1930s and desperately trying to find a way to get out of it. Almost every single country desperately needed a strong leader to take over, and they all got it. All right. These strong leaders, we got FDR. The main reason that we had FDR and we didn't get a Joseph Stalin or we didn't get a Adolf Hitler or a Benito Mussolini is because FDR was here. It would be really scary to think about what would have happened had one of those other personalities existed in the United States at the time. FDR, when it's all said and done, never held on to the power that he was temporarily given. That's what happens with a lot of these guys is you give them a little bit of power and they use that power to get more power. FDR doesn't do that. That is really the main difference in him and these other guys. Granted, they're all psychopaths, and most of them did some type of mass execution of their own people at some point that FDR didn't do. Again, personality difference. So we'll talk about today these guys that came to power in Europe in World War II. First, let's talk about Joseph Stalin. So, totalitarian governments. Totalitarian governments are governments that have complete and total control over their people. There are different types of totalitarian governments. Basically, all the guys that we're going to talk about today have totalitarian governments. Hitler, the Nazi Party. Mussolini with the fascist. Joseph Stalin with communist. They're all totalitarian. They have complete and total control. How they have complete and total control is a little different from country to country. All right. And they don't necessarily like each other. I need to throw that out there very early on. So this is kind of a staple that we need to know. We haven't talked about Nazis or anything, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Nazis and communists hate each other with a passion. Absolutely hate each other. So just because they're both two very strict crazy guys doesn't mean that since they're both crazy, they're like in the crazy best friend category. Russia and Germany hate each other. They always have. Communism and Nazism are very different, and they absolutely hate each other. You need to know that heading into this. All right. So Joseph Stalin, here's what happens with him. Vladimir Lenin had taken over after the Russian Revolution in World War I. When Vladimir Lenin had taken over, he was already pretty old. He knew he wasn't going to be around forever. He had created a communist country there in Russia. A lot of good things had happened because people had jobs. It works in the short term. Vladimir Lenin is going to die of natural causes. The guy he's been grooming to take over for him is Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin takes over. So Joseph Stalin is in charge when Russia is hit with the Great Depression. So what is also very interesting about all these guys we're going to talk about is, as awful as they are, and we're going to talk about the horrible things that they did, their people overwhelmingly supported them. That's what people, I think, a lot of times misunderstand. So Stalin is not a likable guy. He is a massive jerk. And most of these guys are sociopaths, if not verifiably so. So Joseph Stalin is going to take over. The big issue they're having in Russia when he takes over is everybody's starving to death. They don't have enough farmland to grow enough food for everybody in Russia. The reason that happens, you look at Russia. Russia is this massive place on the map. The reason that's the issue in Russia is because most of it is near the Arctic Circle, which means it's frozen and you can't grow stuff there. So what happens is there's not enough people growing because there's not enough land, because everybody has these small little farms and they just can't produce enough food for everybody in Russia. And since it's the Great Depression, you can't get food from other countries. So, because you can't afford it. So what ends up happening is Stalin comes in and saves the day. He does. Stalin comes in and finds a way for everybody to have enough food. The way he does this, though, is Stalin goes through and it's called collectivization. It is where he takes everybody's farm and merges them into one big mega farm. He goes over to the people whose farm he just took, their private property, and says, your farm is now part of Mother Russia. If you have a problem with that, you're like shot in the face in the street immediately. Like it's like public execution. So after you do that to the first two guys that have a problem with their farms being taken, guess what the next people say? Nothing. They're like, oh, good job, comrade. And they just let you take their farms. All those farmers that are now out of a job are then used to work on these big mega farms. It's called collectivization. By doing so, though, he makes a lot more farmland, all right? It makes it much more efficient and is actually able to provide for all the people in Russia. So Stalin comes in and is actually liked by his people because he is providing for them. He has found a way for them to have enough food for everybody to survive. He's also like super psycho. So he's super paranoid. He is a dictator. So he is in charge of the Bolshevik Party, which is the Communist Party in Russia. He is the top of it. What he says goes. He has like 50 guys that help advise him each year. I say each year because every year around Christmas, he's like, hey, let's go take a family photo, like a group photo of all of us. And they all go down to the basement of the Kremlin, which is like the White House for Russia. I'm sure it's not the actual building of that basement, or in the basement of that building. But he takes him down there, and he's standing in the middle, like smiling. Like he doesn't really smile. You'll see pictures of him here shortly. He's not a smiler. He's standing in the middle, thumbs up, whatever. And he's like, oh, I forgot something. Let me go real quick. So he leaves the room real quick. And that big camera that's sitting there that's going to take their picture actually isn't a camera. It's a machine gun. And they just mow down everybody that's standing there and kills them all, and then picks 50 more guys to be his advisors the next year. Stalin is crazy paranoid that people are going to try to overthrow him. So here's what's crazy. Stalin, all right, kills almost 20 million of his own people during his reign. Anybody that he thought would possibly overthrow him or stand up to him, he had them executed. Stalin killed considerably more people of his own people than Hitler ever did of his own people. But why is Hitler considered to be the great evil in society and we don't put Stalin there? The short answer is during World War II, guess who we were allies with? Stalin. So if we make him out to be the greatest evil of all time, how does that make us look since we sided with him in World War II? You're splitting hairs on how evil Stalin and Hitler are, but Stalin, very much a brutal dictator in Russia. And I got a little video clip here of him.
In Russian, Stalin means man of steel. The Soviet Union's communist leader Joseph Stalin certainly lived up to his name. During his rule, the Soviet Union achieved unprecedented power, but at the cost of freedom for his people. He launched a brutal transformation of Soviet agriculture through collectivization, forcibly taking over privately owned land, creating a system of state-owned farms. He also took control of manufacturing and production, creating huge government-controlled industries. Stalin created a police state in which anyone who disagreed with the government's policies could be arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia. In 1930, Stalin began the Big Purge. So-called enemies of the people were arrested and executed. Historians estimate between 8 to 13 million people were killed. By 1939, Stalin had firmly established a totalitarian communist government with complete control over its citizens. All opposition was crushed.
So that video says 13 million people. Again, these are the crazy guesstimates that people, have guesstimates on. But that's not talking about the total number of people. When I said 20 million, that was just in one time period that actually had an official name, like the Purge. Like Hitler had the Holocaust, in which 12 to 13 million people were killed, and 6 million happened to be Jews. And we're going to talk about that this unit. But Stalin, during his thing called the Purge, which is basically just like the Holocaust, his undesirables, the people he didn't want, just wiped them out. All right, so you got Stalin over there in Russia. This is the 1930s. Again, all this is in the Great Depression. While we're over here struggling with the New Deal and stuff that's happening over here in America with FDR, this is what's happening in these other countries. All right, Mussolini. Man, so this one is just, people will believe anything if they want to believe it, all right? So Italy's struggling after World War I. Everything's like garbage. It's falling down. So, nothing functions. Unemployment is super high. People are starving to death in the streets. Like, the trains, they rely very heavily on public transportation. They don't run on time. It's really, really bad in Italy. So, what Italy ends up doing, all right, is, nothing. Let me jump ahead. So, there's this guy named Mussolini who's in Italy when it's garbage. So, Mussolini is a general in the Italian military. Long story short, like in the Roman Empire, one of the issues they had was the fact that they give the generals all the money and then the generals pay their troops instead of just like the actual government paying the troops. The problem with that is the troops are more loyal to the general than they are to their home country. It was an issue that happened in Rome all the time. Italy has never changed this. So Mussolini is a general. He thinks the country is being run like garbage and he thinks he can do better. So Mussolini gets his army and has them march into Rome, which is the capital of Italy. His troops were all black, so they are called the Black Shirts. Real original. So Mussolini, and this is in the late 1920s, he marches into Italy to take it over and is willing to shoot anybody that stands in his way. Italy is so garbage at the time that they don't even stand in his way. When they see Mussolini showing up to take over the government's like, oh, thank you. Somebody wants to do this because we have no idea what we're doing. And they're like, absolutely. And they just give him the government. And then they go out their way, and now Mussolini is in charge. So Mussolini aggressively takes over Italy. But since they didn't know what they were doing, they're like, just good on you. Absolutely, you can have it. When Mussolini takes over, within 2 weeks, he is able to go out in front, and he would give these speeches to these massive crowds. He would go out in 2 weeks and be able to tell everybody, every single person is employed. Nobody is starving to death in Italy anymore. Every train is running on time. And not only all that, Italy now has the largest military the earth has ever seen. And he's able to say this in 2 weeks. Guess how people in Italy feel about Mussolini? They love Mussolini. So here's what's crazy. And this is absolutely baffling. You know how he was able to say that? Because he's a liar. He didn't fix anything. He just said he did. And everybody believed him. Like, he's like, nobody's starving to death. And there's a guy on the street starving to death. He's like, yay! Like, it makes no sense to me how the entire country was so desperate to turn things around that when he just told you that it was better now, everybody's like, hooray! Right? Not only that, so Mussolini would give these huge mega speeches in front of people. So when he gives a speech, he's like, you know, and Hitler does the same thing. Gives these big rah-rah speeches, get everybody super hyped. The thing about Mussolini is that's his basic only, like, personality. So if you meet him in like, privately, like, oh, Mussolini, very good speech. He's like, yes, I want a good speech. Like, that's just kind of how Mussolini interacts with the population. That's just his personality. But Mussolini, now, this guy isn't in charge for like 6 months, a year and a half. He's in charge for 20 years, 2 decades of just lying to his people about how great it is. And everybody bought it. Now, I need to start because Stalin is communist, right? So that they go in their own little nugget of, you know, they're communists. Mussolini and Hitler, they both claim they are socialist, all right? The thing is they can claim that all they want. Based on the concept of socialism, especially by our modern concepts of socialism, socialism is a very broad term. They ain't socialist. When we talk about the Nazis, the Nazi party literally has socialist in the name of it. They're not. So even though they call themselves socialists, we had to come up with a term meaning the rest of the world after this. What do you call this style of government where it's just like one dude that basically rules with his personality, very similar to the way Hitler does it, very similar to the way Mussolini does, even though they are two different in pretty effective ways. What do you call that? So we have historically called them fascist. All right, that is just a term given to their governments during World War II. It's never used any other time, just during their time, just during World War II. So Benito, Mussolini, and Hitler will be called fascist. They would never have called themselves fascist. They would call themselves socialist, even though by our definition of socialism now, they're nothing like what socialism is. So they're not even though they called themselves that, that's not what we would classify them as looking back on them. So Mussolini is very totalitarianism. He has complete total control over his country. He doesn't fix anything. He just tells them it's better, and they're very confident. Since his own people believe it, the other countries believe it as well. Since Mussolini says he has the largest army on earth, America also believes he has the largest army on earth because that's what he's saying. Leading up to World War II, when America starts getting involved, he is one of our main. We view him as a much bigger threat than Hitler because we are convinced he has a big army because he's convinced everybody else he does. He doesn't. He's a big fat liar. But that is our mentality going into World War II, is that Mussolini is going to have this big mega army. He doesn't. But it does affect our decision-making process. We view him as a bigger threat, like if we have to fight him, or I shouldn't say threat, I should say challenge. He's a bigger challenge that we assume going in than Hitler would be. So I have a video clip here of Mussolini giving a speech. It starts out in Italian. They do some subtitles underneath it. Basically shows you how everything he does is just a show. Like there's no substance behind anything that he does. All right, let's pull that there. Oh, so wild action if you're hanging on the edge of your seat on that sentence. I don't know why it jumps through like that. So here's some, this is a photograph. This is Joseph Stalin here on the left, and this is Mussolini on the right. A little bit like Mario and Luigi. All right. So, brings us to our next guy. Oh, Hitler. Now, as I may have mentioned to you guys before, I took an entire course on Hitler's rise to power here in grad school. So, I know too much stuff in my brain. So, I'm going to try to streamline this as much as possible so I don't go down 1,000 little different rabbit holes on Hitler's rise to power. Here's the craziest. So, is Hitler the most evil man that's ever existed? It's possible. Probably not the most evil. Like Charles Manson, these other people are probably worse. To be the guy he is at the level he is, and his just absolute bonkers view of the world is crazy. Because yes, he killed a lot more people than Stalin. Or sorry, Stalin killed a lot more people than him. Hitler was in charge a lot less than Stalin was. Had Hitler had the same massive amount of not only space that he can control and the amount of people he controlled like Stalin, Hitler absolutely would have killed more people. So, let me go through the story of how Hitler becomes the leader of Germany, and Hitler's going to be the one that's going to kick World War II off. Like he's going to try to take over everything. So Hitler, he was an artist. He joins the military in World War I. He actually has to join the German military because he's from Austria. And anywho, so after World War I, he's a homeless guy. He's an adult. He's about 20 years old. And he's a homeless guy and he's a painter. Like he tried to sell paintings on the street. So Hitler has a skill that very few people in the history of the world have as good as him. And that's his ability to talk. Hitler can convince anybody of anything. If he came into the classroom and I gave him 5 minutes to try to convince everybody why the Holocaust was a good thing, after he left after 5 minutes, you'd be like, you know what? He's got a point. Like he can get in your mind that much, and he can do it to individual people. He can do it to massive crowds of people like Mussolini did. While Mussolini was just like rah, 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 rah all the time, Hitler also could do that in the big crowds, which gets the crowds hyped up. But when you meet him one-on-one, he's very calm, cool, and collected. He's very charismatic. If you've ever been around somebody who just naturally has that draw that you want to be around them, Hitler had that. The fact that he has all these positive characteristics, like that you can't see through his psychoness, is more terrifying than anything else. So Hitler, what he does is he's basically just a homeless person one day and decides, I want to take over the world. All right. Now he's a sociopath. He has like no conscience or emotions. There's no possible way that he can and do what he does in life. So Hitler is going to say whatever it is that Hitler needs to say in order to conquer the world. I'm not convinced that he actually hates Jewish people at all, even though he constantly talks trash about Jewish people. He uses that for political gain. There's a handful of reasons, and we'll get there because we'll talk about the Holocaust. Hitler hated everybody equally, right? The only person he didn't hate was himself. And so Hitler will use words, whatever words he needs to gain power. So he's wandering around in the 1920s in Germany, when the Treaty of Versailles is really beating him down, and he finds this political party called the Nazi Party. So he doesn't found it, but is a small group. He goes and listens to what they say. What the Nazi Party says is, all right, and so it was already created before he showed up. It says, hey, the reason the rest of Europe treats us so bad is because they're jealous. They hate us because they ain't us. So basically, the rest of the world knows how elite the German people are, and they're trying to hold down the German people because they know that the German people are better than everybody else. Hitler's like, I can work with this. They're also like, the current government is garbage because we had to like forfeit World War I and not a single battle took place in Germany. We should never have quit. He's like, yes, I can work with this. So Hitler goes out, and he's like, hey, can I say something? Like at the first meeting, he stands up and gives some awesome speech. Everybody's like, this is fantastic. And they're like, will you be our leader? And he's like, yes. So the Nazi Party becomes an entire political system. However, Hitler is almost like a demagogue here. He's not a religious figure, but people follow him as if he was a religious figure, like with the same adherence. Because if you're voting for the Nazi Party, you're voting for Hitler. Even though the Nazi Party has like tons of people in all different like elected platforms, without Hitler, the Nazi Party doesn't exist. So it's kind of interesting how that works out. So Hitler's like, oh, everything sucks, like, Treaty of Versailles, all this other stuff. He says all this stuff in the 1920s. He's actually not popular. In the 1920s, like, they keep running for elections and stuff, and he doesn't win. He actually gets arrested and put in jail for, like, basically talking too much trash. He eventually gets out of jail because Germany's so poor they can't even keep him in jail, and they put him like, okay, you can't be like inciting any riots for a couple years, which he abides by in the 1920s. So he's just a politician, nothing fancy. He says crazy stuff, but a lot of politicians were saying crazy stuff. Then the Great Depression hits in the 1930s, and everybody loses. I mean, Germany was already struggling. The Great Depression just wipes Germany out. Hitler rises to power by promising everybody everything. He promises the people starving to death that food will be free. He promises the farmers that they're going to get 3 times as much for their crops now. Like, he literally just blatantly lies and tells they can have their cake and eat it too. Promises everybody everything. Like, that's what he does. While simultaneously talking trash about Jewish people. Like, but he wasn't, a lot of political parties did. There's only like 2 political parties, and they had like 10 in Germany. There's only like 2 political parties that even allowed Jewish people to be in their political party. So Germany already had this anti-Semitism thing going on, this like discrimination against Jewish people. So in the 1932 elections, and this is what's crazy. So the way the chancellor works, so there's like basically like two guys in charge. There's the president, and then there's the chancellor. The chancellor is over the government. The president is like an elected official that is separate. So the chancellor and president are pretty much the same. Whichever political party gets the most votes in their government, all right, it's called the Reichstag. Whoever gets the most votes in the German government, right, whatever political party that is, then gets to pick who they want to be in charge. So, like, here's what happens. The Nazis in the 1932, because they had promised everybody everything, get more votes than any other political party in Germany. The Nazis are voted in. Not like Mussolini when he showed up with guns. The German people voted the Nazis in. Hitler says he's going to kill all Jewish people. Now, here's the thing. Other political parties have been saying crazy stuff too. They don't ever actually do it, all right? But Hitler said crazy stuff, and he's not lying. He fully plans on doing it. People hear that, they vote him in. So, I mean, this is why Hitler's so terrifying. This is a modern democracy. And they vote in the Nazi party, and then obviously when the Nazi parties get in, who do they want to pick as their chancellor? It's Hitler, all right? So Hitler becomes the chancellor so he's like head of the government, or head of like their Congress, the Reichstag. But he also has a guy who's equal with him called the president. So I don't know if you're up on the name of this dude who's the president is President Hindenburg. That's right, the same name as the blimp this had happened before, that blimp that went down and burst into flames. Hindenburg is like, he's super crazy old. He's like 87 or something, and he dies like the first year that Hitler is the chancellor and he's the president. President Hindenburg dies in Germany, and then Hitler, instead of allowing for an election to take place, he's like, yeah, I'm also the president now. And he's now the chancellor and the president. Boom, he's in control. And then he's like, oh yeah, and the rest of the government, y'all can go home. And just shuts down the rest of the government and sends them all home. You're like, people would be furious. No. And here's where it gets weird. Germany is desperate at the time. Absolutely desperate. Hitler promises to fix everything for them. Hitler does. Now, they gradually start treating, taking rights away from Jewish people. The Holocaust, like concentration camp, death camps, that's a building process. All right, it basically just starts out more discriminatory, no violence at the very first. But he turns around, he does a lot of interesting things economically, which really does help out the economy. A lot of it was like a shell game where it looked better than it really was, but people believed in it. He put a lot of people to work. He built the Autobahn, this interstate highway system that was such a good idea that's what we copy. So like I-40 that goes right through Davie County, that was it's called the Eisenhower Interstate System, created by President Eisenhower, who was a general in World War II, who saw how awesome the Autobahn was when he was in World War II. And we literally, our interstate highway system is copied from the Autobahn, which was an idea that Hitler's administration came up with, that the Nazis created to not only move military equipment across the country very quickly with an interstate highway, but it also put a whole bunch of people to work and everybody was struggling for jobs. So Hitler comes out in 1932. Had Hitler died, and this is a crazy statistic, had he died in 1936, he would be today in 2020 considered one of the greatest leaders in German history. Like, he actually does a whole bunch of stuff, but he's crazy, all right? After a while, he just starts implementing this crazy stuff. A lot of like the really crazy stuff, like with the Holocaust, was super secret. He knew he couldn't just like tell people this was happening. So he did stuff secretly, and we'll talk about the Holocaust as we get there, because that's what everybody associates him with, and rightfully so. But Hitler was loved by his own people, all right? America sees him, we're like, having a dictator, that ain't going to turn out good. It's like, so we see him, but we're like, nah. So Hitler... he hides this crazy pretty well from his people. But he tells his people they're better than everybody else. He is fixing their economy. Hitler is absolutely loved in Germany in the 1930s. So Hitler comes out. He has this idea of Nazism. Which is like what he says is a form of socialism. We look back on it, and this is once again another concept of fascism, but it's like hyper nationality. So Hitler is now in charge in Germany. I got a video clip here of him.
At the end of World War I, Adolf Hitler was just another jobless soldier wandering around Germany. In 1919, he joined a small political party called the National Socialist German Worker, the Nazi Party. Like communists in the Soviet Union and fascists in Italy, the Nazis practiced an extreme form of nationalism, believing that the interests of their country were more important than any others, even more important than personal rights and freedoms. Hitler quickly rose to power to become the Nazi Party's leader, or Führer. In his 2-volume book Mein Kampf, My Struggle in English, Hitler spelled out his Nazi beliefs. He sought to unite all German-speaking people into a national state. He also maintained that the German or Aryan race was superior to all others. Hitler thought his master race deserved more land, even if it meant taking it by force. The economic hardships in Germany in the early 1930s helped Hitler and the Nazi Party gain power. In 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were jobless, and Hitler's promise to restore German pride and stature in the world appealed to them. As head of the Nazi Party, Hitler was appointed German Chancellor in January 1933. He quickly put an end to the faltering Weimar democracy and established his Third Reich, a totalitarian regime with himself as dictator. Hitler capitalized on hate and racism, blaming Jews for the economic problems plaguing Germany. Jews were ousted from government positions and certain professions, and barred from the use of public facilities. They were isolated and forced to wear a yellow Star of David. The discrimination escalated in November of 1938.
We haven't got there yet. This is jumping ahead 5 years in the middle of the World War II.
And at their places of work and worship. Nearly 100 Jews were killed, more than 1,000 synagogues burned, and over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. This came to be called Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. Jewish property was seized, and Jews, Gypsies, and other groups considered unfit for Hitler's master race were sent to concentration camps. Over the course of the war, 6 million Jews and 5 million others were murdered by the Nazis. This became known as the Holocaust. The extent of the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps would not be fully realized until the war ended in 1945.
So something else I need to mention. We are going to talk about the Holocaust and explain to you how it took place in Germany. It's insane. Like, even today, to think about the Holocaust is absolutely insane. So what's important to understand is that nobody knew the Holocaust was happening. Like, people did know, but like, it's so far-fetched. Like, what do you mean he's systematically just executing like fully healthy people that could be helping his war machine? Why would he be doing that? Like, in the heart of the war, they're like, no way. So nobody believes it. So the Holocaust, while it's happening all during World War II, it is tried to be kept super secret, and then people, when they hear about it, that, you know, the top officials in other countries, they just don't believe it. Like, who would do that? It doesn't make any sense, because it really doesn't. Well, you would make those people be forced labor in your factories. You wouldn't just execute them, but Hitler's a psycho. So none of our policies in World War II revolve around the Holocaust because we don't believe it. It's not until World War II ends and Hitler has committed suicide, spoiler alert, that we're like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe, and the whole world is just horrified that this could happen. And here's why he is so evil and viewed that way in our society. This happened in a democracy, in a modern democracy. This is not a third world country. There is really no difference in Germany's electoral system and America's. And that is what makes everybody look at themselves and be like, oh my gosh, surely that couldn't happen here, right? Like, and after World War II, the German people are so disgusted at themselves for allowing it, like, but we'll get there at the end of this unit. But Hitler comes to power completely legally. Now, he absolutely has people killed, once he gets into power and as he's going to power, but that's, again, not going down all these rabbit holes. But he technically did things completely legally and was elected, or the Nazis were, and then he was appointed chancellor by the Nazi Party. This is another picture of Hitler. All right, Francisco Franco. This one's really quick. So you've never heard of this dude, but we're talking about dictators. You got to talk about Francisco Franco because it's a history class. So this is Spain. Here's what happens. There's a king in Spain. His name is King Bourbon. There's a high general that works under King Bourbon named Francisco Franco. When the Great Depression hits, Francisco Franco thinks that King Bourbon isn't doing enough to fix the stuff in society, and he doesn't think King Bourbon cares. So what ends up happening in Spain is a massive civil war. Half the country is going to side with Francisco Franco, who is going to declare war on the king, which is King Bourbon in Spain in the 1930s. It is it's a civil war. So it's tons of Spaniards killing Spaniards. Everybody dies, figuratively. And Francisco Franco wins. King Bourbon has to flee, and he has to go hang out in England for here on, because he's like got family, and he's the royal families hang out together. So he flees. Francisco Franco is a dictator now in Spain. So all the other dictators, here's another one, Francisco Franco. Here's why you never hear about him again. In World War II, which is getting ready to start, nobody gives a crap about Spain. All right, Francisco Franco's got like 3 guys left, like. That's all that's left. So they make no impact in World War II. Nobody wants to take them over because they're still drastically recovering from their civil war. So if like any of these other countries take over Spain, why would you do that? Because then it's your problem to have to fix it. So everybody just turns a blind eye to Spain because they just finished a civil war, which means they were fighting each other. There's very few people that are left in Spain. So because of that, there's very few people left in Spain, so because of that, they don't really play any part in World War II.
Certainly took one on the chin. The proud kingdom of the Bourbons takes a nosedive. The most important day in the history of Spain, when Franco, the rebel flyer, becomes the idol of Madrid, and Alfonso takes a back seat. Revolution. The day when the people overthrew their royal leader and declared themselves liberated. Now, they're citizens of Spain, instead of subjects of the king. The whole country's in a frenzy, hysterical with their newfound freedom. And over in London, thousands of people jam Victoria Station to get a look at King Alfonso, who has taken refuge among his royal British relatives. His ex-majesty had to leave Spain in a hurry. But is he downhearted? He doesn't look it. even though he is just plain Mr. Alphonse Bourbon. Certainly took one on the
All right. So this is a picture of Francisco Franco. And again, it's important to talk about because he's yet another dictator that happens in Europe. But he's not. We're not going to talk about him again. He's a non-entity in World War II because he doesn't have anything left that can fight. All right, and that is as far as we're going to get. So I will see you guys tomorrow.